Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel NPA Discovery. There are people who become famous because they achieve extraordinary success. There are people who are remembered because they made millions of dollars, appeared on the biggest television shows, walked onto the greatest stages, and became icons of their generation. But there are also people who are remembered for an entirely different reason. They didn't simply step onto a stage to entertain. They stepped onto the stage to challenge society. They touched subjects other people avoided. They said out loud what many people were only willing to think privately. And sometimes, because of that, they paid an extraordinary price. Lenny Bruce was one of those people. His name may not be as familiar to mainstream audiences today as the names of modern comedians. But if you look closely at the history of American stand-up comedy, you'll discover something remarkable. Many of the things comedians consider normal today were once almost unimaginable on stage. You could talk about politics. You could satirize religion. You could talk openly about sex. You could question morality. You could make jokes about subjects society considered untouchable. But the road toward greater freedom in comedy did not happen naturally. Part of that road was opened by people like Lenny Bruce. And that is what makes his story worth revisiting. Not because Lenny Bruce was a perfect man. He absolutely was not. In fact, if we look at him simply as a hero of free speech, we miss half the story. Bruce was a brilliant but chaotic artist. He could see through the hypocrisy of society, yet he often failed to control his own life. He wanted to break down the restrictions placed on art, yet he remained trapped by the restrictions of addiction, money, relationships, and his own impulsive decisions. And that is why his story is so complicated. So today, we're not simply going to tell you what Lenny Bruce did. We're going to ask a more difficult question: can a person change an entire culture, even while their own life is falling apart? I believe the answer is yes. But Lenny Bruce's story also shows us that being a pioneer is sometimes far less glamorous than we imagine. If you enjoy stories about famous people whose lives contain far more complexity than the headlines suggest, make sure to like this video, share it with someone who enjoys Hollywood history and American culture, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Every like, every subscription, and every share gives us the motivation to continue creating deeper stories, not simply telling you what someone did, but trying to understand why they became the person they became. And now, let's begin. The child who didn't have an ordinary childhood. Lenny Bruce was born Leonard Alfred Schneider. If you only looked at that name, there would be nothing to suggest that this boy would one day become one of the most controversial figures in the history of American stand-up comedy. His childhood was not surrounded by a stable family environment. His father, Myron Schneider, worked in the shoe business and was often away from home. His mother, Sally Marr, was a performer who also pursued comedy. After his parents separated, Sally had to work to support her son while continuing to pursue her career on stage. Bruce therefore spent part of his early life moving among relatives, and his education was somewhat fragmented. Now, let's pause here for a moment. Because there is something very easy to forget when we look back at the lives of famous artists. We tend to begin with the success. We see the adults standing on stage. We see the lights. We see the laughter. We see the audience. And we forget that before becoming an icon, that person was once a child trying to understand the world. A child who might not understand why his parents separated. A child who might not understand why his family was different from everyone else's. A child who may learn to use humor as a survival mechanism. This is an especially interesting point in Lenny Bruce's case. His mother wasn't simply the person who raised him. She was also the person who introduced him to the world of performance. Sally Marr understood the stage. She understood audiences. She understood how someone could walk onto a stage with almost nothing and still make an entire room pay attention. Years later, Lenny Bruce became famous. But his mother's influence remained. This wasn't simply a story of a son following in his mother's footsteps. It was something deeper. Lenny Bruce grew up in an environment where performing wasn't merely a profession. It was a way of surviving. A way of earning money. A way of observing people. A way of seeking recognition. And perhaps most importantly, a way of turning painful experiences into something that could make other people laugh. That is a skill many great comedians have possessed. But it also has a dark side. If you become accustomed to turning everything into a joke, sometimes it becomes difficult to know when you're actually being serious. And Lenny Bruce's later life would prove exactly that. Marriage, love, and terrible decisions. In 1951, Bruce married Honey Harlow, a burlesque performer. It was a highly complicated relationship. Bruce wanted to make enough money to help his wife leave the burlesque world. But his methods of making money were often far from stable. He experimented with different schemes. One of the most famous involved pretending to be a priest in order to collect donations for an organization he established under the pretense of helping a leper colony in British Guiana, now Guyana. In roughly 3 weeks, the campaign collected around $8,000. But according to Bruce's own autobiography, much of the money did not go where it was supposed to go. Only around $2,500 reached the leper colony. This is an extremely important detail if we want to understand Lenny Bruce fairly. Because if we turn him into a rebellious hero, we distort history. Bruce was not a saint. He lied. He made irresponsible choices. He hurt people. He made decisions that we cannot excuse today. And that is precisely what makes his story complicated. A person can fight against the dishonesty of society while living a deeply contradictory life themselves. A person can speak about truth while still lying. A person can want to liberate others while being unable to liberate themselves from destructive habits. That is a very human paradox. And perhaps that is part of Bruce's appeal. He wasn't a character written for us to admire in one simple way. He was a deeply contradictory human being. Hollywood didn't know what to do with Lenny Bruce. Bruce tried to enter Hollywood. He and Honey Harlow appeared together in the 1953 film Dance Hall Racket, a project Bruce also helped write. But the movie failed. He continued trying other projects. Yet 1950s Hollywood was a world governed by strict rules. Censorship was powerful. Things that could be said in a small nightclub could not necessarily appear on the big screen. And Bruce began to realize something: maybe film wasn't where he belonged. The stage was. He returned to stand-up. He worked in burlesque clubs. These were not glamorous venues. They weren't the kind of stages used to launch major stars. But there, he found an audience that fit him. An audience willing to hear things that more prestigious clubs didn't want to hear. Accounts of Bruce's career note that working in these less prestigious venues helped him break free from old restraints and develop a more spontaneous style. This is a lesson I think many young people need to hear today. Don't be ashamed of where you begin. Your first job may not be your dream job. You may have to work in a tiny room. You may have to deal with difficult customers. Your first video may receive only a few dozen views. Your first song may go unheard. Your first product may fail. But sometimes the least glamorous environment gives you the freedom to experiment that nobody else is willing to give you. Bruce found his voice in places many people might have considered the bottom of the entertainment business. And that is a paradox worth remembering. Sometimes you have to travel very far away from where you want to go in order to discover who you really are. Television wanted Lenny Bruce, but it was afraid of him. As Bruce became more famous, television began to take notice. But television executives were afraid of him. They worried that he might say something outside the approved script. So when he appeared, producers often wanted to control his material in advance. That may sound familiar to us today. But imagine an era when television consisted largely of a handful of major networks. If those networks rejected you, you lost one of the most important ways to reach a mass audience. Bruce understood this. He also understood that the attempt to control him made what he said even more interesting. Through Steve Allen, Bruce eventually got an opportunity to appear on television. Rather than simply follow the expected format, he improvised a joke about Elizabeth Taylor's recent marriage to Eddie Fisher. That was Lenny Bruce. If you told him, "Here's the script," he might think, "Fine. But why should I say exactly what you wrote?" This is what makes improvisational performers powerful. They read the room. They sense the audience. They recognize the moment. And they react. But this is also why they can be dangerous to tightly controlled systems. A performer can be controlled when reading a script. It is much harder to control someone who is thinking out loud in front of thousands of people. Bruce was that kind of performer. When the joke was no longer just a joke, Bruce became famous for pushing jokes to extremes. One story that demonstrates his unusual moral logic involves books he once stole as a gift for his friend Andre Previn. His reasoning was absurdly comedic. If he had simply purchased the books, the financial cost would have been insignificant. By stealing them, however, he created a risk of being arrested and sent back to prison, which in his twisted logic made the gift more valuable. That was Bruce's style. He didn't necessarily want you to believe his logic. He wanted you to see the absurdity within it. And this is one of the fundamental techniques of comedy: take an idea, push it to an extreme. Then make the audience wonder, wait, why does that almost make sense? That's when comedy becomes a tool for thinking. A good joke doesn't always just make us laugh. Sometimes it makes us realize that we're following a particular pattern of thought. Bruce was extremely good at breaking patterns. But there was a problem. When you continually push against boundaries, eventually the boundaries push back. And with Bruce, that happened dramatically in the 1960s. Britain closed its door, and America started making arrests. By the beginning of the 1960s, Bruce had achieved an international reputation. But it wasn't always a flattering one. British authorities once prevented him from entering the United Kingdom, labeling him an undesirable alien. In America, things became even more serious. Between 1961 and 1964, Bruce was arrested multiple times over obscenity-related allegations connected to his performances. Several cases did not result in severe consequences. But in 1964, everything changed. A New York jury convicted Bruce. The judge sentenced him to 4 months in a workhouse. And what makes the case particularly remarkable is that several famous figures publicly supported Bruce, including Woody Allen, Bob Dylan, and James Baldwin. Imagine the scene. A comedian standing before a court. Not because he committed a violent crime. Not because he robbed a bank. But because of what he said on stage. From a modern perspective, this can feel strange. But historically, it represented a major confrontation between art and social standards. And the story raises a question we still debate: how dangerous can words really be? A joke can hurt. A statement can offend. An artist can use shocking language. But if the government begins deciding exactly which words an artist is allowed to say, we enter dangerous territory. Because today the target might be a joke. Tomorrow it could be an opinion. The day after that, an idea. This is why Bruce's legal battles became such an important part of American comedy history. But once again, we should not turn him into a flawless symbol. He was a talented artist. He was also deeply flawed. Both truths have to exist at the same time. But there was another enemy the courts couldn't defeat. While Bruce was fighting police, courts, and censorship, another battle was taking place inside him. Addiction. The source material describes Bruce as having used multiple addictive substances over many years, with his health suffering as a consequence. This is the part where we need to be completely honest. Talent does not protect you from self-destruction. Fame does not protect you. Money does not protect you. The ability to make thousands of people laugh does not protect you. A person can stand on stage and control an entire room. Then walk off stage and completely lose control of their own life. That is the tragedy experienced by many artists. They can create a powerful version of themselves on stage. But their private lives may be entirely different. Bruce seemed to have a complicated relationship with destruction. He understood darkness. He brought that darkness into his comedy. And sometimes, an artist can become so familiar with darkness that they no longer know how to leave it. There is something particularly revealing in Bruce's observations about humor. He suggested that his comedy grew out of destruction and despair, because if the world were completely peaceful, without disease or violence, someone like him would have nothing to joke about. That isn't merely a joke. It reveals how Bruce saw the world. He didn't see comedy as simply telling a pleasant story so people could have a good time. He saw comedy as a way of dissecting human instability. And perhaps that is why his comedy could make people laugh and feel uncomfortable at the same time. The comedian who stopped laughing. On August 3, 1966, Lenny Bruce was found dead in the bathroom of his home in the Hollywood Hills. He had not yet begun serving his 4-month sentence. Authorities found items associated with narcotics at the scene. A life filled with laughter ended in a scene with nothing funny about it. No stage. No spotlight. No audience. No applause. Only silence. And this is where the entire meaning of Bruce's story changes. Because if he had simply died after a long, successful career, we could tell the story as a legend. But he died in the middle of a battle. A battle with the law. A battle with censorship. A battle with addiction. A battle with himself. And perhaps that is why his death makes it impossible to ask only, was he funny? The larger question is, how much did he have to pay to speak in his own voice? Was Lenny Bruce really a hero? Now we come to the most important part of this story. I want to make an argument that some people may disagree with. I don't think we should simply call Lenny Bruce a hero. But I also don't think we should view him only as a controversial, addicted, reckless troublemaker. Both perspectives are too easy. A complicated human being deserves a complicated judgment. Bruce did things that were deeply wrong. He engaged in deception. He had chaotic relationships. He struggled with addiction. He hurt people. He made irresponsible decisions. At the same time, he accomplished something extraordinarily important. He forced society to confront questions about the boundaries of comedy. He helped expand the possibilities of stand-up. He demonstrated that a comedian could use the stage to discuss serious social issues. He showed that one person standing alone in front of an audience could turn personal experience into social commentary. That legacy cannot be denied. But legacy does not erase mistakes. And mistakes do not erase legacy. That is something we need to understand when we look at history. What if Lenny Bruce had been born 50 years later? Let's try a thought experiment. What if Lenny Bruce had been born in the age of the internet? What if he had YouTube, TikTok, podcasts, X, Instagram? What would he have done? He might have caused controversy every week. One video could go viral. One sentence could be taken out of context. One group would love him. Another would demand that the platform remove him. One brand would want to work with him. Another would cut ties. And social media would turn every controversy surrounding him into a machine that never stopped. But there would be another difference. Today, an artist doesn't necessarily need a major television network to give them permission to perform. They can publish their own work. Film themselves. Edit themselves. Distribute their own content. In some ways, that makes the modern world freer. But it also creates a new problem. Bruce once confronted a handful of gatekeepers. Today, an artist may face an entire crowd. A sentence can spread instantly. A 20-second clip can be removed from its original context. And millions of people can judge you before watching the entire story. So if Bruce were alive today, perhaps his battle wouldn't have disappeared. It would simply have changed form. What does this story really say about freedom? There is something I want to emphasize. Freedom does not mean that everyone has to like what you say. Freedom also does not mean you can say absolutely anything without consequences. Freedom means that different ideas are allowed to exist, including ideas that make us uncomfortable. That is where Lenny Bruce matters. A mature society is not a society without controversy. A mature society is one capable of arguing about controversy. You may dislike a joke. You may think it is vulgar. You may think it is offensive. You have every right to object. But the next question is, how do you object? Do you refuse to buy a ticket? Do you walk out of the show? Do you criticize the performer? Or do you demand that the government imprison the person who said it? Those are very different things. And that is why Bruce's story remains relevant. The man who saw through the fake. At Bruce's funeral, Reverend William Glenn Esk described him as a man who stood against an artificial world and tried to shatter its false facades. I think that is one of the most powerful ways to understand Bruce. Because his comedy didn't simply say, laugh. It often said, look at how we're pretending. People say sex is dirty while consuming it. People say power is noble while using power for personal gain. People say everyone is equal while treating people differently. People say society is civilized while committing incredibly cruel acts. Bruce searched for those contradictions. Comedy became his magnifying glass. He magnified contradictions until we couldn't avoid seeing them. That is the power of satire. It doesn't always provide a solution. Sometimes it simply makes it impossible for us to continue pretending that the problem doesn't exist. Don't forget the human behind the legend. Perhaps this is the most important thing I want viewers to remember after watching this story. Lenny Bruce wasn't a statue. He was a human being. He had a childhood. A mother. A wife. A daughter. Friends. Ambitions. Moments of success. Moments of regret. Days when he could make an entire room laugh. And days when he couldn't control his own life. That is why we shouldn't reduce him to a single story. He cannot be summarized as, controversial comedian. He cannot be summarized as, free speech icon. And he cannot be summarized as, young addict who died. Each of those descriptions captures only part of the truth. Lenny Bruce was the combination of all those contradictions. And those contradictions are exactly what allowed his story to survive long after many other comedians of his generation faded from memory. His legacy was more than his jokes. When we talk about the legacy of a comedian, people often ask, what were his most famous jokes? But with Bruce, the more interesting question is, what did he change? He helped expand the idea of what stand-up could be. Stand-up didn't have to be, here's a funny thing that happened to me. It could be, this is how I see society. It could be political. It could be moral. It could be religious. It could be sexual. It could be about power. It could be about hypocrisy. It could be about fear. It could be about the comedian himself. And that was an important development. Today, we can watch a comedian stand alone on stage for 90 minutes and discuss intensely personal or political subjects. That may not shock us anymore. But there was a time when this kind of performance was extremely dangerous. Bruce helped open that door. Other performers walked through it. Later generations pushed it even further. That's how art evolves. One person pushes a boundary. Another sees the new boundary. Then someone else pushes it farther. What if Lenny Bruce had never existed? We can never know exactly how history would have unfolded if Bruce had never existed. Perhaps American comedy would still have become more open. Perhaps someone else would have emerged. Perhaps television and society would eventually have changed anyway. But history isn't only shaped by people who are uniquely capable of doing something. It is also shaped by people who appear at the right moment and accelerate a process already underway. Bruce was one of those people. He wasn't the only one. But he was one of the most visible. And the important thing isn't to give him all the credit. It's to recognize his place within the long chain of people who helped make artistic expression more open. A question for all of us. Now I want to ask you a question. If you had lived in the 1960s and watched Lenny Bruce perform, what would you have done? Would you have laughed? Would you have walked out? Would you have protested? Would you have called the police? Or would you have stayed and asked yourself, why does this man make me so uncomfortable? That's a very important question, because sometimes what makes us angry isn't the statement itself. It's the fact that the statement touches a truth we don't want to confront. Of course, the opposite is also true. Not everything that makes us uncomfortable is true. Not every controversial artist is profound. Not everyone who is criticized is a genius. That's why we need critical thinking instead of idolization. Listen. Analyze. Challenge. Agree when you believe something is right. Disagree when you believe it is wrong. But don't turn a human being into a symbol simply because they said something you wanted to hear. The price of being ahead of your time. One of the most popular stories we tell about pioneers is, they weren't understood in their own time. Sometimes that's true. But it can also become a way of romanticizing failure. Bruce was certainly ahead of his time in certain respects. But he also made mistakes that no era can justify. Being ahead of your time does not exempt you from responsibility. And that is an extremely important lesson. If you're a creator, you have the right to experiment. You have the right to be different. You have the right to say something nobody has said before, but you also have the responsibility to live with the consequences of what you create. Courage and responsibility are not opposites. They belong together. The final lesson from Lenny Bruce. If I had to reduce Bruce's entire life to a few lessons, I would choose 5. First, don't be afraid to be different. Bruce didn't become legendary by trying to sound like everyone else. Second, don't confuse being different with being right. A person can be unconventional and still be wrong. Third, don't allow talent to hide the problems you need to solve. Talent cannot replace discipline. Fourth, don't turn your pain into your identity. You can create art from pain without living inside that pain forever. And fifth, protect the freedom to think, but also protect the ability to think responsibly. That may be Bruce's deepest legacy. The man standing under the lights. Imagine the final image. A stage. A microphone. A man walks out in front of hundreds of people. No special effects. No giant LED screens. No modern technology. No team of dozens of people behind him. Just one human being and the thoughts inside his head. He speaks. Some people laugh. Some people become uncomfortable. Some walk away. Some love him. Some want him silenced. But he keeps talking. That was Lenny Bruce, a man who could make an entire room laugh but couldn't make his own life simple. A man who fought against external restrictions but was also defeated by internal ones. A man who wanted to tear down society's hypocrisy while carrying many contradictions of his own. An imperfect man. Not a saint. Not an absolute hero. But a human being who left a mark. And perhaps that is how we should remember him. Not by saying, Lenny Bruce was always right. But by saying, Lenny Bruce forced us to ask questions. And sometimes, that is the greatest thing an artist can do. Not give us answers, but make it impossible for us to stop thinking. Today, we live in a world where almost anyone can pick up a phone and speak to millions of people. We have more freedom. But we also have more responsibility. A sentence can travel around the world in minutes. A joke can become a global controversy. An idea can inspire. But it can also hurt. So the story of Lenny Bruce doesn't belong only to the past. It belongs to the present. Every time we debate how free art should be, Bruce is still present in that question. Every time an artist is asked to remain silent, his story returns. Every time someone stands before an audience and says, I know you may not like this, but we need to talk about it. We see a small part of his spirit. But remember the other part as well. Don't learn only from Bruce's courage. Learn from his failures. Don't only learn how to break boundaries. Learn how to recognize which boundaries deserve to be broken, and which ones exist to protect us. Don't only learn how to speak. Learn how to take responsibility for what you say. And most importantly, don't wait until your life is falling apart before realizing that talent alone cannot save a person. We need discipline. We need people who love us. We need honesty. How much truth are we willing to allow to be spoken? That question is still here. On stage. On television. On the internet. In our arguments. In art. And within ourselves. So if you're watching this today and pursuing a dream but feel like you're starting too small, remember the man who once earned $12 and a meal for one of his early performances. If you're afraid of being different, remember that the people who change art rarely begin by being loved by everyone. If you're going through failure, remember that a dark chapter does not necessarily mean the end. But if you're destroying yourself, stop. Don't romanticize it. Don't call it the price of success. No success is worth your life. No art is worth destroying yourself for. No applause is worth more than your existence. Become a stronger version of the pioneer. Have their courage. But also have the awareness they sometimes lacked. Break the boundaries that need to be broken. But build the boundaries that allow you to live longer, healthier, and more creatively. And if one day you step onto your own stage, whether that stage is a great theater, a small room, a camera, or simply a phone sitting on your desk, remember that the audience doesn't need you to be perfect. They need you to be genuine. But the most powerful kind of authenticity isn't saying everything that happens to enter your mind. The most powerful authenticity is having the courage to look at yourself, to see both your light and your darkness, and then decide what kind of person you want to become. Lenny Bruce left us a microphone. Not literally. But as a symbol of the right to speak. Now that microphone belongs to our generation. The question is, how will we use it? If you found this story meaningful, please like the video. Share it with someone who loves Hollywood history, comedy, or stories about the people who helped shape American culture. And if you want to keep exploring the lives of famous people whose stories behind the spotlight are far more complicated than they appear, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because here, we don't just tell stories about famous people. We explore the human beings behind the names. The successes. The failures. The choices. The mistakes. And the lessons that remain after the stage lights go dark. Lenny Bruce stepped onto the stage to make people laugh. But in the end, his story made us think. And sometimes, that is the greatest legacy an artist can leave behind. Thank you for watching. And I'll see you in the next story.